Thanks, Simon. The certificate on compliance and completion, we've heard from Jennifer this morning about the process of putting in the commencement notice. Certificate of compliance and completion relates really to two types of notices, the 7-day notice and the commencement notice with compliance documentation. And if you don't have the notice in, you won't get the CCC. So the Certificate of Compliance and Completion, it's covered in SI 9 of 2014. It's a very short document. It's on the regulations, the Building Control Amendment Regulations that they're referred to. 30 pages, 15 or 16 pages of that are the statutory forms. So the regulations is covered in about 15 pages of responsibilities, and they relate to the procedures for and obligations to submit the notices from the owners, builders and designers, the roles that the local authority plays in processing and validating the notices and applications and the certificates. So it's important when Article 20F covers the thing, but item 9, you think it should be at item 1, is a certificate of compliance and completion may refer to works, buildings, including areas within a building or developments, including phases thereof, and relevant details shall be clearly identified on the certificate of compliance and completion itself, and subject to validation in line with the requirements of paragraph 3 and 4, and placed on the register. And the paragraphs 3 and 4 really should be known off by heart by all the local authorities, because that's really where their skill set has to come in the validation. But the certificate and the wording is key to the end of the selling of the building, that it describes the work that the person is certifying as well. So it's important that that is done very well. So that paragraphs, it tells you there that it's commencement notice without additional documentation in the 7-day notice. The only certificate of compliance shall apply to them following types of notices. And remember, before works or to which parts 2 or parts 3A apply may be opened or occupied or used. So you'll find that it refers to parts 2, parts 3, parts 3A, and you also need to be able to flick back to understand. So what is part 2? Its application of part 2 is the requirement for a notice. And it only relates to commencement notices for the erection of a building, a material alteration or extension of a building, and a material change of use to which building regulations apply. And the building control regulations are related to building regulations, not planning regulations, all that. The 7-day notice is where part 3 applies to the works, which is a fire cert. And you're submitting a notice before the fire cert has granted. And that's important when you go to the items 3 and 4 for validating. Well, someone submits a certificate of compliance and completion. Has the statutory process been concluded, which is the fire cert? Has it been granted? So the Certificate of Compliance and Completion, Part 3, this is really the regulations as it is in SI 9. And it tells you that the Certificate of Compliance shall be in the form specified in the 6th schedule, which is the sample form, accompanied by such plans, calculations, specifications, and particulars are necessary to outline how the building or works as completed. When you go back to Jennifer on the commencement notice, to be completed, differs from the plans, calculations, specifications submitted. Article 9 and 20A are the 7-day notice and the commencement notice of compliance documentation, the requirement for the notice, and the annex to the Certificate of Compliance and Completion, and then complies with the requirements of the 2nd schedule of building regulations and relevant technical guidance documents. So that's the parts A to M of the building regulations, and accompanied by an inspection plan is implemented by the assigned certifier in accordance with the Code of Practice referenced on the 20G1. So it all brings you back to the thing. So the applicable works, any works where a commencement notice with additional documentation was submitted, including a 7-day notice to the Building Control Authority, the required documents, and this is what the sign certifier must submit, is the form, signed and dated, and annex to the certificate completed, the plans, calculations included on the schedule, and the inspection plan. The forms, that's just that it's signed, part A is signed by the builder and part B is signed by the sign certifier. So it's to be aware of what you're actually signing and their obligations, whether it's the builder or the sign certifier. And the annex is part of the statutory form. We allow on the BCMS you to upload a separate document as the annex, but as part of conveyance, that annex is part of the certificate and needs to be sent on when you're selling the property. The certificate of compliance and completion, and what documents and forms, and there's an FAQ 29 there that shows what's required to be submitted. This is a kind of a more detailed breakdown, and you have your ancillary certs, your site layout drawings, and you need to be putting in whether it differed from the original one. So it goes back to Jennifer's comment that if you have a good document submitted at commencement stage, a schedule of documents that outline how the building is going to comply, most of these documents will feed in here. You're also checking what was designed and what's yet to be designed, and then you're able to cross-reference that. And this is what the local authority can do, is they can go back to the notice when they receive the certificate and cross-check what did they submit at the commencement stage, the schedule of documents, and are these documents on their annex? And if they're not, it's a revised information. So the certificate of compliance, and this is really part of 3 and 4 where they're validating it. So the Building Control Authority shall record on the date of receipt of the certificate. The BCMS does that. Considers within 21 days of the date of receipt whether the certificate of compliance and completion is valid, having regards to the requirements in paragraph 3, which we already showed you what the requirements was with the statutory forms and the annex and the inspection plan is in. And then the building control's own satisfaction that all this information requests and statutory processes, including any applications for certificates on the parts 3, parts 3A or parts 3B relevant to the building concerned have been satisfactorily concluded. And what's satisfactorily concluded? Means that they've been issued and granted. So this is really a simplified thing of the requirements of 4, is check the documents, the form of compliance, is it signed, dated, the description and the address of the building or works are clear and in accordance with 20F, so that the building can be identified or parts of that building can be identified in the certificate. The annex to the certificate of compliance and completion is fully completed, and that should be cross-checked with the schedule of documents that's issued on the commencement notice, whether it be on the 7-day or a normal commencement notice with compliance documentation. And they should all list all the drawings and all that they're relying on to demonstrate compliance. The inspection plan is implemented by the sign certifier, should detail all the inspections, and then complies with the requirements of the second schedule of building regulations and the relevant technical guidance documents, building regulations. This is the one that Building Control Authority scratched their head on. How am I going to do this from the paperwork? So it's the commissioning certs, it's the sign-off and all that document. And if they're not in the annex of documents, it makes your job tougher to actually sign off and validate that application. So that's why the annex of documents is very important. Don't have to verify that you've got all the documents, is that a sign certifier has provided that list of evidence that they're the documents he's relying on. Now you can select any document at random just to verify that he does have that document. And if he has one of the obscure documents, you could probably reasonably risk assess that he has the rest of the documents. So the certificate on compliance and completion. So the all enforcement notices, information requests, including applications, parts 2, 3. And so that's your fire search, your disability access search, your dispensations, relaxations have been granted. Your information request, so was 11.3c request for information sought for that building or the works to that building? And if you haven't issued a section 11.3 and you've maybe went on site and you said, I'll something wrong with that building, I'll come back to you. Tough. If it's not on the system, you can't come back at CCC stage and say, do you remember that meeting we had in site and you were going to give me this? If you don't put it in paper, you can't get it. You can't refuse it. The reasons are in accordance with 3 and 4. And if you have requested information and it hasn't been sought or submitted to you, you can invalidate that certificate. But if you haven't sought that, you can't invalidate for something you haven't sought. So it's pretty obvious. You can't go outside and be ultra-virus. Same was if you've issued an enforcement notice and it's been addressed and concluded to the satisfactory, or is it still in court or that, you can invalidate for the reasons that still outstanding enforcement. The information is pretty clear, is that once they submit that information, and that should be in the annex if an assigned certifier gets an information request, he has to record that in his annex of documents and show that he has a report to close that out. Right? Now, if they are not going to make it valid, they have the 21 days on the receipt of the certificate to write to the persons who submitted him, inform, given reasons. So if you're going to invalidate, you have to give a reason that the certificate does not comply with paragraphs 3 and 4. That requirement that you must meet is that the reason must be outlined in paragraphs 3 and 4 for the certificate, and can local authority, or you can a person to submit a new revised certificate. So maybe the address was wrong, the description was unclear, it wasn't signed, it wasn't dated, it wasn't signed by the right person. That's a revised. And any such additional document as being deemed necessary by the Building Control Authority to accompany the certificate for the purpose of paragraphs 3 and 4, and that may be to close out the Section 11 request, to close out the enforcement, to deadlines with the Building Regulations Part A to M. And that may be verification of a Part L report, ventilation validation, which Emmanuel is going to talk to in the afternoon about the commission search in relation to Part L and F. As constructed drawings, another easy sort of thing. But this goes back to what was given at the commencement stage and what you've got at completion stage. Are they totally different buildings? Do you know? So building control notice in accordance with paragraph 5.1 shall return to the person given the certificate and the documents accompanied by the certificate. That's if it's received over the counter. On the BCMS, it's just deleted. Revised information. So the revised as clear as possible. No ambiguity. You've one shot. You ask for it. You can't, when the information comes back in, that you're not asking for it again and again and again, you know? Because if someone takes a judicial review, they're going to look at a process. Request in relation to the certificate, so it's not signed, dated, clear description of works, and for other such documents and it goes back to what you're allowed to ask for on the 3 and 4. So you can't ask for, confirm that you paid your planning fees or levies or that you have your landscaping planned on or conditions on planning. Nothing to do with building control. So the validation of the CCC, where the building controller considers that the certificate complies with 3 and 4, it shall no later than 21 days. 21 days to make the decision whether to validate or invalidate the application, and you must do it in accordance with paragraphs 3 and 4. There is, where you request revised additional documents if appropriate, may avail of a further 7 days within which to consider the on or before the expiry of the 7-day period, if considered that no further action is warranted pursuant to Part 5, shall enter the particulars in the register. So the information you get in, then you have to reassess it to see, are you happy that it complies? And that may be in relation to the requirements set out in paragraphs 3 or 4, whether that may be Part 3 really relates to the application process and the forms, and compliance with Parts 8M of the building regulations. The Part 4 is the statutory processes, the Section 11, the enforcement. So where plans, calculations, and specifications under 3B and the inspection 3C has been submitted to a building control authority on a date that falls between 3 and 5 weeks prior to nomination date. So this is pre-notification, and a lot of these discourage this from a point of view is that it kind of put, and a lot of sign certifiers too discourage it from a point of view, it puts undue pressure onto them to meet a target that's not within their gift or control, so that they're relying on third parties to provide the certificates, complete the work, builders, ancillary designers, stuff like that. So it is something that we don't get a lot of it. You still have whatever the date you nominate on. So you have 1 day before that, the nominated date, to submit all the information. If it's not submitted on that date, the local authority can invalidate it for the reason that the information wasn't submitted. And they have to start the process again. So, not gifting the legislation to say that you can extend that nominated date. It's not provided for in the regulations. So a third party person that may be objected to this building at planning stage might take a judicial review that the local authority prefers in amending the date. So you have to be careful. Remember that you carry out the regulations, not make your own regulations. So validation, and we'll go to this, is solely based on the assumptions and the facts stated in the forms. You're not checking every little detail that. You're assuming that the person who's putting in that are going to provide information that's true and accurate and in compliance with the requirements of legislation. If at any time after validation it's found that inaccuracies in the notice and the application, certificates, declarations, then it can be subsequently invalidated. It can affect sales, conveyancing. Under Section 16 of the Act, any person who contravenes by act or omission any requirement of the Act or notice under this Act shall be guilty of an offence and may be prosecuted and subject to penalties under Section 17 of the Act. So prosecution does carry a cost. Note, building control authorities are not planning, they're not roads, they're not water, they're not waste authorities. Their function is building and building regulations, building. So valid commencement notice in itself does not mean that you have legal entitlement to commence work or any issues outside the remit of building control will be brought compliant the regulatory authority. So you get a house and they change the elevation that required planning permission and you receive a certificate of compliance and completion in accordance with building regulations. You can validate it. You don't have to, just because it doesn't comply with compliance. That's another statutory obligation that they have to go in and get the retention plan permission for that. So that's outside your gift. You can only process what you have and you can't invalidate that CCC for any other reason, only what's given in paragraph 3 and 4 of the regulations. So the role of the Building Control Authority, these are the code of practice, for fire certs and disability access certs and issue decisions on those applications. CNs and 7-day notices and accompanying certificates, notice of assignment and notice of undertaking. Validate and register the certificate of compliance and completion and accompanying documents submitted in support. Maintain a public register of building control decisions and activities. That's currently for commencement notices and CCCs, that's on the BCMS. The Building Control Authority should maintain records, including records of inspections, undertake a risk analysis of each commencement notice submitted to inform inspection arrangements, and advise the assigned certifier in relation to issues of compliance related to buildings and works and disputes between parties. And that's the role with the local authorities. The inspector is out there to actually advise, point them in the right direction on how to meet the compliance. Nobody wants problems, you know? If you give someone a problem and you walk away, you don't know whether the problem is going to be resolved or fixed. So it's easier to give someone the solution. Submission at completion stage. So the completion stage, the assigned certifier is required to submit the following: certificate of compliance signed by the builder and himself, the plans, calculations, inspection plan, and these are all outlined in the code of practice. The code of practice for inspecting and certifying building works, a nominated date, register, and these are all relevant in the thing. And it's all about getting that information that you've provided compliance to the building regulations. So we're going to just show you what a typical building control officer has to do when he receives a certificate of compliance and completion. And this is what the local authorities see compared to the local government BCMS site. And it's really a replicate of what goes in on the BCMS by the assigned certifier. So the details of the building, the CN number related to it, the local authority be there, and the type of works. The completion cert is a full completion of the building or works, and was there a DAX, the submission numbers at the CCC application and the date of submission. And they just go through all these checks from a point of view of the details around it. The roles, are they the people that signed the statutory forms? Are they the people that was actually on the commencement notice? They're the type of checks that they have to do around the professionals. And is the assigned certifier on what the engineers, chartered engineer, the registered building surveyor, or the RAI register? Documents. So have they submitted the 3 documents, the certificate of compliance and completion, the compliance, that's on the thing is wrong, and annex the documents, so that should be the inspection plan is implemented. And that's been like that for years, and we didn't cop that. But we're going to get through all this, and they were the three only documents that they're required to. They're not required to submit any other supporting documents unless the building control may request them. People upload this because they've been kind of told by local authorities that we want to get these 5 or 6 documents if you pair each building. But the problem with that is that they focus on getting them documents, but they don't focus on filling out the rest of the documents. And that's why it's important to get an annex of documents, because that gives you a more complete picture of the building that they've certified. Plus it gives you the option to actually investigate, have the other documents there? Do I need to be a bit more random and obscure so that I can, and it's not a thing. This is not really, the CCC is not about a carrot and a stick approach that you get thing. This is to ensure compliance with the building regulations. The control process is just to bring everyone along. And the validation is really, the application is submitted. If you select complete, you're going to validate it. If you select the revised information, you're going to request revised information. And you can only request revised information in relation to paragraphs 3 and 4, which is related to the process, which is the 3 forms. The inspection plan is implemented, the annex of documents, and completion. Then you can go to documents, so you can select any document annex. I would like to see that commissioning cert for the ventilation system or third-party validation ventilation. And that's the important part of that transparency that and even the sign certifiers, we get guys putting in documents that are related to the planning. So we'd want where the schedule of documents for a commencement notice related to what was put in for a planning application, including a fee of €64, of €5 for the planning fee. So these are things that have to be checked by the local authority in the validation process. And it is a validation. You're not signing off this building. You're checking that the documents, and there's reasonable documents there to justify that that building complies with the building regulations. And if you haven't carried, you're doing a desktop study on the different information that's been done. So if you've actually been on site and you've found it reasonable, you need to be able to justify it. And waiting 21 days to press the button and we'll validate everything on the 21 day just because we can is not really proper. Because if someone takes a judicial review and you're asked, why did you wait 21 days? You better have a good reason for a judge. So the revised information is really just what that's part of the thing, and then who's requesting the information and the date that you want the information back by. So you've requested the information. You can't come in on the 20th day and say, I want to see all of them documents that you put on your annex. It's a bit unfair and unreasonable. So you be looking, you have 21 days. So if you're not assessing that application in the first week, and at bare minimum the second week of your 21 days, really you just have to validate it. Do you know? Remember that certificates of compliance and completion is submitted to a building control authority shall do under no duty to any person. So you have the biggest exemption as a local authority. You're not responsible whether the facts are true or accurate or that. Ensure that building or works in the certificate relate to either the works completed, require them to comply with the building regulations or free from defects. Ensure that the certificates comply with the requirements of this Act or the regulation or other under this Act, and stated in the certificate are true and accurate. So that's the owner, builder and designer responsibility to ensure that whatever they have information uploaded on the BCMS is true and accurate, and the facts comply. So the builder was, the subcontractor was, and you made a mistake, you uploaded the stuff from another site. You can go back to the local authority and say that you made that mistake. Remember too that certificates of compliance and completion, and once they're validated, they go on the register. There may be address errors, stuff like that. So if you do come across this, you need to contact your local building control authority, who can put in some way of rectifying this, because the information, people do make mistakes. It's not, and it is correctable. It's paperwork. And remember, this is a paperwork process. The building is a different animal altogether. And we need to understand that when we're complying with the building regulations. This is part of the building control process. How do we show how we comply? This is like no difference than putting together a fire cert application, a DAC application. Your compliance documents is one suite of things, and the problem with it, given the guidance and all that, not the same. Not every building is going to be built to the same thing. Not every building is going to have the same equipment into it. It's not going to have the ventilation systems, the heat systems. We have varied alternative means in each guidance document. So it's important that we have all that. The other thing too is the register. So once the certificate is validated, it's placed on the register within 24 hours and it becomes public. And you can search the register on the front site to check it. If you want to get the full register, a BCMS account and log in. So, thanks everyone.